The flight to justice. Black woman asked to switch VIP seats for white passenger. What happens when a black woman, seated in a VIP section, is asked to give up her seat for a white passenger? What begins as a routine flight turns into a battle of entitlement and justice that exposes deep-seated corruption. As this woman stands her ground against privilege, she uncovers a secret that could change everything. Will she be silenced, or will the truth come to light? Stay tuned. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the explosive twists ahead. The low hum of the airplane's engines was a familiar sound to Tasha Carter. As a high-ranking executive in a successful international tech firm, Tasha had been fortunate enough to travel the world in luxury. First-class seats, private lounges, and the occasional helicopter ride to meetings. She wasn't new to the world of corporate perks, and after all the hard work she had put in to climb the ladder, she had earned every bit of it. But today, something felt different. The airplane she was boarding was a private jet, chartered specifically for her team as they headed to a crucial business negotiation in London. Tasha had worked tirelessly on this deal, and this trip was important. It wasn't just another corporate gathering. It was the culmination of months of strategic work, long nights, and high-stakes decisions. As she boarded the jet, she walked confidently to her seat in first class, a plush, leather-covered area with plenty of space to stretch her legs. The flight attendant, a young woman with bright eyes, offered a warm smile and politely pointed to Tasha's seat. "Right this way, Miss Carter," the attendant said. Tasha smiled back, nodding as she adjusted her jacket. She didn't mind the formalities. She had earned the respect of the people around her, and she knew it. However, as Tasha settled into her seat, something unsettling happened. She could feel the eyes of another passenger on her. She glanced over to see a middle-aged white man, wearing an expensive suit, holding a phone to his ear, eyeing her seat. He looked uncomfortable, even irritated. Tasha wasn't bothered. She had seen this before. Entitled behavior from people who thought they could dictate the terms of everything around them. But it wasn't her problem. She closed her eyes for a moment, mentally preparing herself for the negotiations ahead. The flight would be long, and she needed rest. It wasn't long before the flight attendant approached again, this time with a slight hesitation in her step. "Miss Carter," she began, her tone almost apologetic. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's an issue. The gentleman in the seat across from you has requested that you switch seats with him. He claims he's been assigned to this seat, and that it's an error on the seating chart." Tasha blinked, momentarily stunned by the request. The man was clearly in the wrong seat, and she had specifically chosen this one, with a few extra amenities for comfort and privacy. But she had dealt with difficult people before, and she could tell that this wasn't about a seating mistake. It was about entitlement. It was about a white man thinking he could tell a black woman what to do, even in the most privileged of settings. "I'm afraid I'll have to insist that I remain in this seat," Tasha said calmly, without looking up at the attendant. She could feel the tension mounting, but her voice remained composed. "I was assigned this seat, and I've made arrangements for my comfort during the flight." The flight attendant seemed to falter, but nodded politely. "Of course, Miss Carter. I'll speak with him." However, before the attendant could leave, the man, his name, she would later learn, was Richard Holbrook, a wealthy investor, got up and walked directly over to her. He stood there for a moment, looking down at her seat with an air of superiority. "I don't think you understand," Richard said, his voice condescending and laced with entitlement. "I've been upgraded to this seat, and I need you to move. I'm a frequent flyer with this airline, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Tasha remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had dealt with condescending men like Richard before, especially in the corporate world. But what she hadn't expected was that he would have the audacity to try and force her to give up her seat on a private flight. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said, her voice firm and cool. "I've been assigned this seat, and I'll be staying right here." Richard's expression soured. "You're holding up the flight with this nonsense. You're just a woman who doesn't know her place. You can move to the back of the plane, and we can avoid further issues." Tasha's eyes narrowed slightly. A woman who doesn't know her place. That was it. That was the moment when everything changed. She felt the anger start to rise, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't about to let him win. Not now, not ever. This wasn't just about the seat. This was about control, about a man assuming that he could dictate to her what to do because of her race and gender. "You're in the wrong seat," she said quietly, her gaze unwavering as she stared him down. "And if you don't leave me alone, I will be forced to call the airline's corporate office to handle this properly." Richard stood there for a moment, stunned. He hadn't expected this woman, this black woman, to challenge him so openly. His face flushed with anger, but before he could speak, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay." The captain's voice echoed across the plane. "It appears we have a bit of a situation with seating. Please remain seated. We are addressing the issue now." Tasha felt a sense of quiet triumph as the plane seemed to freeze in that moment. But before she could react further, Richard turned to the flight attendant, his voice low and full of threat. "I want her removed from the plane," he hissed, glaring at Tasha. "This is unacceptable. She's disrupting my flight, and I demand that she be taken off immediately. Do your job." The attendant hesitated, glancing at Tasha for a moment, then at Richard, who now had the attention of the rest of the cabin crew. Tasha could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She didn't need to fight him physically. She would fight him with every ounce of her power, using the resources at her disposal. But the next moment was even more shocking than she could have anticipated. The flight attendant stepped back and nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll handle it right away." Tasha's mind went into overdrive as she processed the scene. Was this really happening? Had this entitled man really managed to get her removed from a flight because of a seating dispute? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Before she could act, the attendant turned to Tasha, a nervous look in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but we may need to ask you to move for the sake of the flight. The passenger is insistent, and it's creating a problem." Tasha stood up slowly, a cold fury rising within her. This wasn't just a seat dispute anymore. This was an outright attempt to undermine her dignity. She had to act now, before Richard and his influence completely took control. As she walked toward the front of the plane, her heart pounded. She knew one phone call would change everything, and the moment she made that call, everything would be exposed. The flight was about to take an entirely new turn. The jet cruised smoothly through the sky, the hum of the engines filling the space around Tasha as she sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The slight buzz of the overhead lights and the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of passengers shifting in their seats were the only noises that broke the silence. But Tasha's mind was far from quiet. The moment the flight attendant had approached her, asking her to vacate her first-class seat for Richard Holbrook, she had known this wasn't just about a seating mix-up. It was about something far bigger. The calmness Tasha displayed was a practiced demeanor she had honed through years of dealing with difficult and often toxic situations. As a woman of color in an overwhelmingly male-dominated industry, she had learned early on to keep her composure in the face of subtle and overt discrimination. She had made it to this position by being stronger, smarter, and more capable than those who tried to hold her back. And now, this entitled man thought he could manipulate his way into taking the seat she had rightfully earned? Not today. Tasha glanced once more at Richard, who sat comfortably in his seat with an air of entitlement, his posture relaxed, as if this was all a normal part of the service he expected. His phone was glued to his ear, and his gaze flicked toward her briefly, just long enough to make his disapproval clear. She could feel the weight of his stare, an invisible pressure designed to make her feel small. He didn't know who he was messing with. The flight attendant had returned, this time with a look of hesitation in her eyes. She stood by Tasha's seat, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," she began, her voice soft but apologetic. "The gentleman in 3A is requesting that you switch seats with him. He says there's been a mistake with the seating arrangement." Tasha didn't respond immediately. She wasn't angry. There was no need for anger, not yet, but there was something else simmering beneath the surface. Her seat, her right, was being stripped away with an arrogance that many like Richard didn't even realize existed in the world. He was acting as if his desires came before hers, as if he could simply dictate her actions without any consequence. Tasha finally looked up at the flight attendant, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I've been assigned this seat. I don't think I should have to give it up, and I certainly shouldn't be asked to move for someone else," Tasha said, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't asking. She was stating a fact. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to proceed. She had been trained to follow protocol, to please the passengers. But Tasha wasn't just any passenger. She was a high-ranking executive, a leader who had earned her seat, not just on the plane, but in the room and in the world of business. She wasn't going to let some man with a silver spoon and a phone call dictate her actions. The attendant paused for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously toward Richard, who was now leaning back in his seat, his phone call more important than the growing tension in the cabin. Tasha could see the discomfort in the flight attendant's eyes, the uncertainty. She wasn't sure what to do, caught between the man who believed he could control everything and the woman who had never been afraid to challenge the status quo. "I'll handle it," Tasha said, her voice now coldly resolute. The attendant looked at her, still unsure, but nodded before walking away to speak to Richard. Tasha sat still for a moment longer, watching the interaction between the attendant and the entitled man in 3A. She knew what was coming next, the ultimatum, but she had already made up her mind. No one would push her around today. As the flight attendant returned, Tasha could see the unease written all over her face. Richard's demand wasn't just about the seat. It was about power, manipulation, and privilege. "I'm afraid, ma'am," the flight attendant said softly, avoiding Tasha's eyes. "The passenger insists. He says he won't fly unless he has this seat." Tasha's lips curled into a slight smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was one of defiance. She could feel the shift in the air, the moment where everything changed. The entire crew was caught in this web of manipulation, and Tasha wasn't going to let Richard's entitlement dictate the outcome. "Not this time." "Then I guess you'll have to get him off the plane," Tasha said, her voice as sharp as ice. "Because I won't move." The flight attendant hesitated before turning to leave. Tasha could see her walking back toward Richard, who was now talking louder into his phone, apparently not noticing the tension that had been building. But Tasha wasn't done. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about the principle of it all, respect and equality. Richard had just tried to bully her, to strip away her dignity. And now, she was going to make sure he paid for that. Just as she was about to lean back in her seat, confident in the power of her stance, the door to the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped into the cabin. Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she looked up, her mind suddenly alert. What was happening now? The captain's eyes scanned the cabin, landing briefly on Tasha before turning to the flight crew. Then, he made beeline straight for Richard. Without a word, the captain knelt next to Richard's seat and whispered something that made the man's face turn pale. Richard immediately stopped talking on the phone, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. He blinked twice, his arrogance replaced by a look of shock. The tension in the cabin grew even thicker. The captain was involved now. Tasha sat back slightly in her seat, watching the scene unfold. She had no idea what the captain had said, but she knew this was about to become a lot bigger than a simple seat swap. Whatever was going to happen next was going to make or break this flight, and her sense of justice. Cliffhanger for Part 3. Just as the captain and the flight attendants exchanged quick, hushed words, Tasha's phone buzzed. Her heart skipped as she looked down, seeing a message from her assistant, Marcus. "Call me now. It's urgent." Tasha's blood ran cold, the sudden urgency in Marcus's message sending a wave of anxiety through her. Something wasn't right. She had a sinking feeling that her fight for respect on this flight wasn't the real battle she was about to face. She didn't hesitate. Tasha pulled out her phone, hit the dial button, and pressed it to her ear, her mind racing as she waited for Marcus to pick up. The flight attendant's footsteps echoed as she walked away, her face pale with discomfort. Tasha's phone was still pressed against her ear, but her focus was now split between the growing tension in the cabin and the urgency of the message she had just received. The entire situation had escalated quickly, but the unseen forces behind the scenes were now in motion, and she needed to be ready. The captain, having whispered something to Richard, now stood rigid in front of him, his expression grave. Richard Holbrook, who had been so smug just minutes ago, was no longer the same man. His eyes darted nervously toward the flight attendants and then back to the captain. Tasha could see the shift in his demeanor. Something had happened, and whatever it wasn't good news for him. Her heart still pounding, Tasha forced herself to stay composed, watching the scene unfold before her. The flight crew moved quietly but quickly, their actions careful and deliberate. It was clear they were trying to avoid drawing attention to Richard's seat, but there was no denying that the tension in the cabin was now palpable. Tasha's thoughts were racing. She wasn't just sitting here as a passenger anymore. She was now part of a situation that had escalated far beyond anything she'd imagined when she boarded this flight. But she wasn't scared. In fact, the moment she had stood her ground and demanded that Richard respect her space, she had known this was no longer about a seat. It was about power, privilege, and entitlement. The phone call from her assistant, Marcus, had added a new layer of anxiety. His message had been urgent, cryptic even. The urgency in his tone left her with a feeling she couldn't shake, a sense that something was wrong, something bigger than the drama unfolding on the plane. Marcus wasn't the type to send such messages without a reason. Whatever he had to say, it was important. She reached down, pressing the phone to her ear again as it continued to ring. This time, she wasn't as calm. She needed answers. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked when he finally picked up. "Tasha, I need you to listen carefully. This is bigger than just a seat swap on a plane." Marcus's voice came through, his tone tense. "We've just gotten word. There's an internal investigation into Richard Holbrook. His name's been flagged in a massive scam involving offshore accounts and illegal investments." Tasha's stomach tightened, the reality of the situation hitting her like a blow. "What do you mean flagged?" she asked, her voice growing firmer. "I'm not sure about all the details yet, but it looks like the investigation's tied to the company's financial records. Holbrook's been pulling strings behind the scenes, laundering money through fake contracts with some very dangerous people." Marcus continued, his voice filled with concern. "This is no longer just about you, Tasha. I need you to be careful." Tasha's mind raced. She had worked alongside Holbrook and had always thought of him as a privileged businessman, but never suspected the depths of his involvement in illegal activities. The reality was sinking in. The man who had demanded her seat wasn't just an arrogant businessman. He was part of something far darker. "Is there anything I need to do?" Tasha asked, trying to process everything Marcus had just told her. "We've got your back. Just stay calm. Don't let him know you found out." Marcus paused, his voice lowering. "Whatever happens, the feds are already monitoring him, but you can't let this distract you. The flight crew is already on edge. Do what you have to do, but don't engage with him more than necessary. We'll take care of the rest." Tasha exhaled sharply, hanging up the phone. Her entire reality had shifted. What had started as a petty argument over a seat was now part of a larger conspiracy, one that she could not afford to ignore. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her as the cabin grew quieter. Richard Holbrook, the man who thought he could use his wealth and power to control people, had no idea what was coming for him. Tasha wasn't going to let this go, not when there were so many lives at stake. As Tasha stood by her seat, she noticed that the crew was acting a little too hurried, a little too cautious. They hadn't said much, but the exchange between the captain and Richard had shifted the entire tone of the flight. The once peaceful jet ride was now a powder keg, ready to blow. She knew that she couldn't let herself be distracted. She had to remain focused. Tasha glanced back to see Richard's face, a mix of disbelief and growing anxiety. He had thought he could intimidate her, force her to give up her seat, and accept his authority. But now, the truth was coming out, and Richard's power was slipping through his fingers. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of satisfaction, It was empowering to realize how easily his veneer of control had crumbled. But there was still more to do. She wasn't just going to expose him. She had to protect herself and everyone around her. The investigation into Holbrook would have repercussions, and she needed to be ready to act. As the plane continued to hum, Tasha turned her attention to the flight attendants, who were clearly nervous. The captain had returned to his seat, but his expression was clouded with concern. Tasha could sense that they knew something big was coming. They were all operating in an environment of uncertainty. Richard's name wasn't just in the air. It was in the system, flagged for deeper scrutiny. Her earpiece buzzed again, this time with a message from Marcus. "Get ready. The feds are moving in." Tasha's heart rate kicked up. The federal agents were closing in. What started as a seating dispute was now a game of cat and mouse, with dangerous people on both sides of the coin. Just as she adjusted herself in her seat, Richard stood up abruptly, looking more anxious than ever. He walked toward the back of the plane, his gaze darting toward the flight attendants. The arrogance was gone. He was now fully aware that things were out of his control. As he passed by Tasha, he shot her a cold, threatening glare. Tasha didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a small smile, a smile that said everything she needed him to know. The game had changed. Richard's steps slowed as he neared the rear of the plane, but suddenly, the loud buzzer of the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin once more, but this time, it was different. It was urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the unexpected turn of events. We are experiencing an issue with the aircraft and need to make an emergency landing immediately. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the crew." The words sent a chill through the cabin. Tasha's eyes widened in disbelief. What did this mean? Had Holbrook's situation escalated so far that it now threatened the safety of everyone on board? Before she could react, the plane's engines shifted, a sudden lurch indicating that the plane was no longer cruising smoothly. It was a subtle move, but it was enough to send the passengers into a quiet panic. As the plane began its descent, Tasha's mind raced. What was really happening on this flight? She had one chance to figure this out, and time was running out. She needed to stay ahead of everything, and more importantly, she needed to stay ahead of Richard Holbrook and the mess he had dragged her into. The sudden jolt of the airplane sent a ripple of panic through the passengers. Tasha could feel the uneasy tension in the air, the murmur of nervous voices rising as the plane began its descent. The once calm flight had turned into a situation of unknown urgency, and Richard Holbrook, the man who had started it all, was at the center of it. Tasha tightened her grip on her armrest, her mind racing. What had just happened? Why was the plane being diverted? There was no announcement from the captain yet, and the crew members were moving swiftly down the aisles, speaking in hushed tones to one another. The feds had been monitoring Richard, and Tasha had no idea if this emergency landing was part of a larger operation to apprehend him, or if something else was at play. She glanced over at Richard. His earlier smugness had dissolved into sheer panic. He was gripping the seat in front of him, his knuckles white, as his eyes darted around the cabin. The arrogance that had marked his every movement just hours ago had evaporated, replaced by a deep unease. The flight attendants had started their emergency procedures, calmly instructing the passengers to fasten their seatbelts, put away their personal items, and prepare for the landing. But Tasha knew that the situation was far more serious than just a simple flight delay. There was something going on beneath the surface, something hidden behind the official announcements. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. She quickly reached for it, pulling it out and looking at the screen. It was Marcus, her trusted ally from the FBI. The message was short, but the weight of the words was undeniable. "The feds are closing in. Get ready. Holbrook is the key, but there's more to this than just him." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She had already suspected that Richard Holbrook wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a misplaced sense of entitlement, but now it seemed like the situation was even deeper than she could have imagined. The plane lurched again, signaling a change in altitude. The engine noises grew louder as the aircraft began its rapid descent, heading toward an unknown landing. Passengers were uneasy, whispering, some clutching their armrests, others looking nervously out of the windows. Tasha's focus, however, remained on the unfolding situation with Richard Holbrook. She stood slowly from her seat, making her way down the aisle toward the front of the plane. The crew was busy securing the cabin, but Tasha had a feeling they were missing something important. She could feel the heat of Holbrook's stare burning into her as she walked past him. He wasn't even trying to hide his panic anymore, but she wasn't concerned with him anymore. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place, and it was clear that Holbrook was at the center of something far more dangerous than just a simple seating dispute. As she reached the front of the plane, the captain stepped out from the cockpit. His face was tense, his eyes darting quickly between the crew and the passengers. He looked directly at Tasha as she approached. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, "we're facing a situation here, and it's not just a flight. The feds are taking control, but they need you to hold steady. Holbrook's situation is bigger than we thought." Tasha felt a chill run down her spine. The captain had just confirmed what she had suspected. Richard Holbrook wasn't just a passenger. He was part of something far darker, something that now involved national security. "Where are we landing?" Tasha asked, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "We're making an emergency landing in a secure location. We have to follow protocol." The captain hesitated. "But you need to be ready. If Holbrook is who we think he is, he's got connections, dangerous connections, and those connections are on their way." Tasha nodded, her heart racing as she processed the information. She had been right about Richard. He wasn't just a spoiled businessman throwing his weight around. He was part of a larger operation, and that operation was now threatening the safety of everyone on this flight. Tasha turned back toward Richard, her eyes narrowing with determination. The plan had changed. What was supposed to be a business trip was now a high-stakes operation. She could feel the weight of the moment, the reality of the danger setting in. Holbrook had already proven that he would stop at nothing to protect his interests. But she wasn't going to let him win. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again. This time, it was the captain's voice, but it was far from reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing. Please stay calm and follow the crew's instructions. We're in communication with ground control and law enforcement." The captain's voice faltered slightly. Tasha turned back to the front, her mind racing. What exactly was happening here? Why had the plane been diverted in the first place? Were they landing to capture Richard Holbrook? Or was there something more at stake? Something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated? She took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. The next few minutes would change everything. As the plane began its final descent, the ground below becoming visible through the windows, Tasha's phone buzzed once more. It was another message from Marcus. "They've already spotted him. Holbrook isn't just a passenger anymore. This goes all the way to the top. Be careful, Tasha. Everything you've worked for may depend on how you handle this now." Tasha's stomach tightened, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was fighting for her team, her company, and the truth. The next move had to be perfect. As the plane touched down with a jarring thud, the door to the cockpit opened. 2 federal agents stepped into the aisle. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements precise. Tasha met their eyes. No words were needed. The plan was already in motion, but one thing was clear. They were all now in the thick of a game much bigger than any of them had expected. And as the emergency exit doors opened, the sound of sirens in the distance began to grow louder. Tasha knew this was only the beginning. The question wasn't whether she could take down Holbrook. It was whether she could survive the fallout of everything that was about to happen. Cliffhanger for Part 5. The emergency landing was just the beginning. The federal agents had arrived, but what was coming next? Were they after Holbrook, or was there something much darker at play? What would happen when the agents revealed the full scope of Holbrook's operation? Tasha's fate, and everyone on this flight, was hanging by a thread, and the next part of this story would reveal the shocking truth that no one could have predicted. The emergency lights of the plane flashed in the dim cabin, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the passengers. The emergency landing had been jarring, the unexpected turbulence, shaking the passengers into nervous tension. Tasha sat still in her seat, her eyes trained on the two federal agents who had just entered the plane. She knew that whatever happened next, everything was about to change. The man who had tried to control her, Richard Holbrook, had no idea how close he was to losing everything. As the plane's engines hummed softly, the agents moved toward Richard's seat with calculated precision. The man who had once been so smug and confident now looked like a cornered animal. Richard Holbrook had spent the flight thinking he could force Tasha out of her seat, using his wealth and status as weapons. Now he was facing the consequences of his actions, and Tasha would make sure he didn't walk away from this. The agents stopped in front of Richard, one of them flashing their badges. "Mr. Holbrook, we have a few questions for you," one agent said, his voice firm but polite. "We've been tracking your activities for some time now." Richard's eyes widened, his lips parted, but no words came out. He looked between the agents, then at Tasha, his face pale. "You can't do this." I am a businessman," Richard stammered, his voice rising in panic. "This is a misunderstanding." Tasha watched as Richard's arrogant exterior crumbled, replaced by pure desperation. He had been caught, and it was only a matter of time before the full extent of his criminal activities was exposed. She had known from the moment the flight had started that this wouldn't just be about a seat swap. Richard had underestimated her. He had underestimated everyone who had been working to uncover his empire of lies. The agents didn't flinch. "We've seen the evidence," the agent continued. "You've been involved in money laundering, fraud, and illegal transactions through several companies. Your ties to offshore accounts and criminal syndicates are no longer a secret." Tasha stood up slowly, her expression unwavering. It was finally happening. Everything was coming together. She had worked tirelessly to expose corruption, and today, the truth was winning. She glanced at Richard one last time, her gaze cold. "You had a chance to do things the right way," Tasha said, her voice steady but filled with authority. "But you chose greed. You chose to use people for your own gain, and now you're going to face the consequences." Richard's face flushed with rage. "This isn't over. You have no idea who I am." His voice was desperate now, his bravado completely gone. "Actually, Richard," Tasha replied, her tone sharp, "I know exactly who you are. A man who thought he could manipulate the system to get whatever he wanted. A man who thought he was untouchable. But you're not, and you're going to see just how far your actions have gone." As the plane landed on the secure airstrip at a nearby airport, Tasha's pulse quickened. She had the feeling that the ground was just as unstable beneath her feet as it had been in the air. The plane came to a halt, and as the door opened, federal agents and local law enforcement were already waiting to take control. Tasha stepped off the plane first, feeling the cold air hit her face. The local authorities were gathered in a tight formation, ready to arrest Richard Holbrook. Tasha didn't need to say anything more. She had done her part, and now the law would handle the rest. The officers moved quickly to cuff Richard and read him his rights. Richard's protests were futile, drowned out by the noise of sirens and the growing realization that his empire of lies was crumbling. But Tasha was no longer focused on him. As she turned to the federal agents, one of them stepped forward, his expression solemn. "You did it, Tasha. This operation is a success, and Richard Holbrook is going down. We've already seized his assets and started freezing his accounts. We'll be going after everyone in his network," the agent said, his tone filled with quiet admiration. Tasha didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her mind already processing the next steps. Richard Holbrook was just the beginning. This operation was about more than just taking down one criminal. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. The fight was far from over, but today, they had taken a major step forward. "We've got work to do," Tasha said finally, her voice low but steady. "This won't be the last time you hear from me. There are more people out there who need to be held accountable." Back at the office, Tasha sat in her office, her mind racing as the phone calls came in one after another. The media had already caught wind of the arrest, and her name was now at the center of a media storm. The reporters wanted answers. They wanted to know how a wealthy businessman had gotten away with such serious crimes for so long. But Tasha didn't have time to answer questions. She had been through too much to let this become about her. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what was right, about taking down the people who had hurt others for far too long. The cases they had opened up with Richard Holbrook were just the beginning of something much larger. Her assistant, Marcus, walked in with a stack of papers in his hand. "The media wants an interview with you, Tasha. They're calling it a game-changing victory." Tasha took a deep breath, staring out the window. "Not now, Marcus. The battle isn't over. We've only just begun to clean up this mess." Marcus hesitated before setting the papers down. "Tasha, you've just changed the game. You've taken down someone who thought they were untouchable. That's worth celebrating." Tasha's eyes softened for a moment, her exhaustion showing. She nodded, then stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. "This is just one victory, Marcus, but it's a big one. We can't stop until everyone who's been part of this is held accountable." As Tasha turned back to the desk, she noticed an alert on her phone. It was a news update. The headline read, "Holbrook's arrest leads to new FBI investigation into major corporate scams." She opened the article, her heart pounding as she read the details. The report confirmed that Holbrook wasn't the only one involved. There were ties to corporate executives, politicians, and other key figures in the industry. Holbrook had been just the tip of the iceberg, and now the real fight was beginning. As Tasha read the news, a chilling realization hit her. This was bigger than she had ever anticipated. Her phone buzzed again, this time. It was a message from the federal agents. It was clear. The web of corruption was deep, and it stretched far beyond Holbrook's financial empire. The entire system was involved, and the truth was about to shatter everything. Tasha put the phone down, her mind filled with a sense of resolve. She had won this battle, but the war for justice was far from over. The players had changed, but the system she had been fighting was still standing. Tasha had made her mark, but now it was time to bring down the entire system, piece by piece. As she walked out of her office, Marcus at her side, Tasha knew that the next chapter of her fight for justice was already beginning. In a world where power and privilege often go unchecked, Tasha Carter's stand for justice is a powerful reminder that every voice matters, no matter who tries to silence it. Today, she fought not just for herself, but for all of us who've ever been dismissed, belittled, or overlooked. This story proves that courage can change the game. If you believe in standing up for what's right, don't just watch, be a part of the movement. Like, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to keep the conversation going. Together, we can make sure no voice is ever ignored again.